All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Um, Thanks so much for having me, Kevin, asking me to talk about this issue today. It's a bit of a tricky issue, right? I was sort of listening to Kevin's introduction and thinking, oh my gosh, I hope I can meet the expectation here. About how are these kind of social issues, things that we maybe traditionally have looked at as social issues, impacting the workplace? What do we do when they come up? How are members seeing these things impact their workforces, um, and sort of the relationships between their workers and between leaders and employees in their work environment. Because as these issues do pop up, right? If we're not aware and we're not addressing it, they can become sources of tension, right? There are also places where they're topics, these sort of social issues, that can become an impediment to us being effective in the workplace, right? To teams being effective, to individual employees being effective if they have these things sort of on their minds, or being a source of tension in the work environment. So we're going to talk through a few different things today, to help us kind of understand how these things are impacting the work environment, how they're popping up for MEA members. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today is going to be based on, many conversations I've had with many different members, and trying to put some of those, the topics that routinely come up into buckets to help us all kind of learn from the experiences that we're having during this time. So partly, let's remember some things I talked about at the MEA Law Conference for those of you who attended. Some of the workforce trends, right, and why we talk about some of these topics, right, why they matter to the workforce. And partly, when we're talking about this concept of social issues, right, we have to remember every work environment is sort of a microcosm of larger society. So when you see debates around social issues playing out in larger society, we would be kidding ourselves if we didn't recognize that those same issues that we see playing out in larger society are also present in our workforces, right? Because really, what are we as a workforce? We are a group of individuals working together trying to achieve some business objectives and some business goals. And so we bring with us everything that comes along with that. And in the past, I think employers have really tried it pretty successfully, maybe even not tried, right? Just sort of unintentionally. A lot of us in the work environment had the understanding that, look, these sort of social issues, things that relate to gender, relate to race, relate to sexual orientation, relate to sort of personal identity. We don't talk about those things, right? We sort of observe in a work environment, or we observe a sort of Thanksgiving table rule is a way that many folks looked at it. And I know even many trainers, I know myself, 5 years ago, maybe would say something like, let's follow the Thanksgiving table rule, and not, have a political debate in the workplace. We still don't want to have a political debate, right? But as we all continue to increase our understanding, right, and as social issues sort of move forward in larger society, we have to keep in mind that that Thanksgiving table rule, that's different for every Thanksgiving table, right? For those of you who've heard it, or the dinner table rule, the Thanksgiving table rule. The idea was all of your family members are there. Are you really going to start having a debate about, equity in larger society, or how to get rid of racism, or politics or religion, right? That would sort of ruin the Thanksgiving dinner potentially, right? So we're going to keep those issues at bay. Well, that's only at some Thanksgiving tables, right? There are other Thanksgiving tables where, it's a regular part of our lives to encounter things like racism or sexism in larger society. And that's just day to day for some individuals. And they don't have the option of saying, I'm not going to think about that today, or I'm not going to talk about that because it's Thanksgiving, or it's a non issue for us today because it's a holiday, right? So I use that example, right? So many of us trainers, we have stopped using that as an example, or, sort of an idiom to say, as a guide, because it doesn't apply to everyone, right? It's not optional for everyone to be thinking about these issues or not thinking about these issues. So again, these are all things to be thinking about and keeping in mind. So when we're looking at these kind of trends in larger society, what are we talking about? What types of trends? Well, a lot of these issues, a lot of political issues, a lot of issues around personal identity become political issues and have been used kind of historically in the laws and politics of our society, and they continue to be used in that way. Right. So sometimes we think of these as political issues. Generational differences, right? So there's a fair amount of research out there about the different generations within our workforce looking at these social issues differently. I have trouble even sort of continually saying these are social issues because I suppose they are, but sort of my perspective is they're very much about a lot of these diversity, equity, and inclusion issues are very much about personal identity, right? And just someone being who they are, and being allowed to kind of go about work and life without that holding them back, just who they are sort of innately as a person, right? Um, Even that itself reflects a generational difference, right? Because prior generations haven't necessarily looked at social issues that way, right? And I think very much so the millennial generation and younger generations in the workforce look at a number of these issues that fall under the diversity, equity, and inclusion umbrella, whether it's race, whether it's age, gender, sexual orientation. They view that very much as personal identity, not so much as um, a social issue that's being debated in the political realm, right? So even the way we're talking about this webinar, right, is showing us sort of a generational difference, right? So something to think about. Oh, let me check on my chats. Okay, good. These are just surveys and links. All right, but back to my slides. So remember, we talked about this also at the law conference. For those of you who are there, there are certain sort of signposts, signals, right, markers, indicators that employers can look to get a sense of where should I be directing my workforce? Where should we be directing our workforce when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I would say these are some of those markers, some of those signposts, some of those guides, right? Cultural shifts around personal identity. We're talking about it today, right? Anti-discriminational. I'm combining it, discrimination and organization, anti-discrimination laws and organizational values, right? And always, of course, we're keeping in mind business needs, goals, growth opportunities. So when I'm talking with members, and we're going to talk about some of the common issues that come up around social issues in the workplace momentarily. But when we're talking through those, these are the things I'm always keeping in mind, right? And these are the things, this is the type of information I'm eliciting from members as we talk through these issues, right? I'm always keeping in mind these cultural shifts in around personal identity, the requirements around anti-discrimination laws, where those point us and direct us. And then we have a conversation about what are your organizational values, right? What are your principles and values around communication, right? Around respect for one another, around respect and understanding of the customer. What does your customer base look like? What do you want your customer base to look like in terms of, its breadth, how large it is, what markets you're reaching, what demographics you're reaching with your products or services? And then let's talk about your unique workforce needs. Have you had a particular issue? Has there been a history of a particular type of challenge in your organization, or that employees have focused upon, right? And those where those challenges come from vary, right? Sometimes they are arising out of, and they're certainly influenced by the trends we're talking about right now. But they really come down to the individuals you have in your organization and how they've interacted with each other and how they've treated each other um, in the recent past. And sometimes it goes back beyond the recent times, and sort of has carried through to the present in organizational culture. So again, all things to be thinking about. And then within your workforce as employees, when they're thinking about, gee, how do we address social issues in the workplace, right? These are the signals they look to, right? That they can that they receive, whether you're being intentional about these signals or not. These are the things employees will be looking um, to understand how to handle these things, right? How are our leaders handling these issues, right? What are they saying? More importantly, what are they doing? And I don't mean they're solving the problems of the world, right? Though if you do have a leader who can solve the problems of the world, that would be fantastic, right? But what are they doing day to day, moment to moment in interactions, in talking with employees, in how they address performance issues, in how they communicate, in how they elicit feedback. Kevin was talking just in the introduction today about Apple getting some kind of blowback from making decisions about where employees are going to work without necessarily getting feedback from employees about how it's working for them and how they think their work can be done most effectively. Doesn't mean we're not saying you have to do that, right? But just things to be thinking about as we all try to have an efficient and effective work environment and workforce, right? That perhaps eliciting feedback is a strategy, right? Is a tool you can use to get buy-in for decisions and sometimes maybe even to get the best decision or a better decision for your workforce. So again, things to be thinking about. Employees will look to, of course, your written policies and statements. And those are things I talk through with members pretty regularly. And they'll look at how are coworkers behaving, right? What words are coworkers using? What jokes are acceptable? What lines of debate and topics in the workplace are there, right? And are being allowed, are being encouraged, are being discouraged. And then, of course, the larger trends as well. Employees oftentimes are aware of those as well. So, what am I hearing from members? Well, this is actually a pretty common one. I get a so we've had an issue, right? It's sort of like we've had an issue and now we're doing this training, or then we did this, or now we're thinking of doing XYZ of, with our leadership or our organization of work groups. And typically this is an issue that it's not explicitly violating any laws, right? That would be something that would be in the scope of legal advice and counsel, right? So maybe Amy's handling that, or maybe I'm backing up Amy, and so I'm handling it that day. But I'm talking about outside of that, right? This isn't where there's a clear violation of some type of anti-discrimination law or something along those lines. This is just, well, we had an issue that is interfering with our employees' ability to get their work done, right? And we want to resolve it. We want to address it and we want to resolve it. And often it'll say, well, it was a race issue, but it wasn't really bad, right? Or it was a gender issue, but it's not like we had someone who was just blatantly discriminating against women. Let me tell you what it was, right? It's always sort of, yes, there was an issue, but it wasn't that bad. And I understand why people say that, right? They want me to understand, look, we're not having, we're not hiring raging racists or sexist individuals, or we're not allowing our managers to like berate people on a regular basis. They don't want to be perceived in that way. Organizations don't, of course, right? None of us do. But they also are wanting to recognize, but there is something happening here that isn't great for the efficiency of our work environment, and we want to resolve it. We want to have some increased understanding. We want to open up room for a dialogue within our workforce in a healthy way, so that we can move on from this, right? So when they're calling and saying, I had an issue, what is it? Right. And I'm sort of like, oh, well, what happened? Let's talk about what happened. Tell me what happened. These are some of the common types of issues we're hearing pop up, right? Communicating across cultures, and this is more than just sort of majority minority, right? And I mean that, with respect to any of the demographics we talk about in this space of diversity and inclusion, right? This is more than just our workforce is predominantly employees who are Caucasian, and we have employees who are Hispanic or African American, raising concerns. It's more than that. It's different than that. It's something else that keeps popping up here. Sometimes it is, for example, we have some members with very diverse work environments, demographically speaking, right? In urban areas where their workforce very much reflects the diversity of those urban areas, for example. And so they've got, and many combinations of demographics in their workforces, and there can be disagreements that pop up between those demographics that might be viewed really, if an outsider is looking in, as a minority group and another minority group having a conflict. And that's not just necessarily predominantly the type of issues that I'm seeing, but it is happening, right? And more than one time, I'm hearing this from members. So communicating across cultures, whether it's majority, minority culture, but also any combination of cultures, right? Being offended by something a member of another sort of demographic, a comment they've made, a term they're using to refer to another minority group or historically marginalized group in the work environment or in the customer base, right? And so you may have coworkers complaining that they've heard another coworker using a particular term or using making jokes or actually a lot of times those are the two things that these individuals are finding offensive. It also happens that customers sometimes are complaining about things along these lines, that they have heard an employee say something offensive, that the customer themselves found offensive about another racial or ethnic or gender group. So um, obviously that can certainly impact um, efficiency in the work environment and engagement and employees' level of ability to focus on their work. Right, if they're thinking about, gosh, but I keep hearing my coworker over there saying this term that it's reminding me of, when I've heard that term in my life and it's been upsetting, or when my mom's heard that term, or my family member, my child. It's not the easiest thing, right? Um, and the jokes and the terms in use, they aren't necessarily sort of those bright line um, words or terms that you would know right away are offensive, right? Those, it seems, and most of our members have that under control, which is great, right? That most folks are not using those sort of slurs that we all or very derogatory, outright, very apparently derogatory terms that we're aware of, but smaller, more subtle slights or insults, and sometimes they're not even necessarily slights or insults, and there's some confusion between um, these members of these groups, sort of, or these different demographics within our workforces. And so again, all of this just sort of underscores the need for um, providing your employees with the tools they need, right, to navigate a multicultural and diverse work environment. Um, Small misunderstandings can turn into a bigger issue. This comes up quite frequently. Small misunderstandings, it can be around some of these things we're talking about, like offensive statements or comments, but it can also be just around work or just around a comment about, outside political or social issues. And I've seen a number of times where actually the comments might be coming from a management type level or a leadership type level, and the intention is not bad, right? But um, the comment is sort of showing the employee a lack of understanding about what the employee is going through on a day-to-day basis in their lives, and what they're experiencing in terms of potentially racism or sexism, not necessarily within the work environment, but within larger society. And I can tell when I'm talking with these employees and these employers or the managers or leaders involved that it wasn't necessarily a bad intention. It's a lack of understanding about the other person's experience, right? And sometimes I can tell very clearly that those individuals would not have made those statements um, if they had had an understanding that it was so sort of meaningful to the person who was overhearing it. But this can cause a lot of tension, right? This can cause an employee to feel like, well, I'm not jumping to help this person. I'm not rushing in when they need me. If they can't even respect my reality, basically, of what I'm experiencing day to day. Very complicated kind of issues, actually. That's why I'm like, oh, let me tell you how to solve all this. It's not that simple, right? We all kind of have to think through it and work through it together. And the solutions are really specific to the particular situation or work environment. Another issue that's come up more than more than once is sort of rushing through addressing a sensitive topic, right? So maybe an incident happened, or maybe the company just very quickly kind of put out a video about a DEI topic that they didn't thoroughly vet from many angles, and it's met with um, a little bit of blowback, right? that's sort of like, wait, why are you doing this? Why are you saying these things to us? Why are you sharing this when it doesn't even address what's happening here, right? It can make the employees feel like there's a disconnect between management or leadership's understanding of what's going on and the employees' understanding of what's going on. So a lot of this, again, is about communication, right, between employees and leadership, and trying to get to the root cause of some of these issues. Oh my gosh, as usual, I'm like, I have more slides and I have not that much more time. I just talk through this, right? Why are some of these miscommunications, misunderstandings happening and being focused upon, right? Because sometimes employees are complaining about small incidents, right? Or what might be perceived as a smaller incident. A manager commenting on a social movement, right? You're sort of making a political comment. Um, for example, sometimes leadership, may say something that they don't understand. For example, "all lives matter" is a phrase someone might say and not realize that that could be really offensive and hurtful to someone who's part of a historically marginalized group that identifies with sort of more along the lines of a Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I've talked with folks who they really didn't understand that making a statement along the lines of "all lives matter" might actually be hurtful, or might be insensitive to someone, or doesn't know that that sort of grew out of a white supremacy group responding to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of context that if folks aren't routinely and regularly immersed in that context, right, things can easily go off the rails. And so, always just know you can always pick up the phone. MEA members, you can always pick up the phone and give us a call. Hotline can always connect you with, obviously legal support, but also with some DEI services to talk through any issues you're having. Um, and I want to mention the last statement on this slide, right? The desire for change, because some of this conflict that comes up in the work environment around these social issues, right, is someone being genuinely offended. It can come from a misunderstanding, right? And I think a lot of it comes from this desire for change in larger society, right? Seeing these issues happening in larger society. For example, racism, right? Individuals who have been dealing with racism on a day-to-day basis for their entire lives. They've seen their family members deal with it. They've seen it reflected in their outcomes in life, and they've seen it reflected in the outcomes of their family members in life, right? And then they're seeing on the news over the past couple of years some pretty disturbing things happening with racism as the motivating factor, right, for it sort of being allowed to continue. And I'm thinking of things like the murder of George Floyd and incidents along those lines. And that's pretty traumatic, right? And it leaves people feeling like, or it certainly can leave people feeling like we really need to do something, right? We really need to do something to change this, because this isn't okay. I don't feel safe, or I don't feel like my children are safe. And so that desire for change, right, can reflect in addressing sort of the thing that's right in front of you, right? It might not be the issue at work, the comment that someone made. That might not be the biggest problem, right? And employees may or may not realize this is not the major problem, right? But it is what's right in front of them, what they have within their power and control to try to address, right? And I share that just to try again to increase some of that understanding um, that we all need to have for each other about what motivates each one of us. It's oftentimes the same things, right? We wonder what motivates someone else. It's often the same exact thing that motivates us, right? A desire for yourself and your family to be safe and to have what they need, right? A lot of times it's that simple. It's not some other complicated motivation. It's just that same motivation that many of us have, or that desire that many of us have. And what would any one of us do, right? Um, when that doesn't seem to be happening, right? And continually it doesn't seem to be happening. Um, So anyway, things to think about, things to think about. And where does sort of our legal and compliance signal point us, right? I want to remind folks that there's a lot built into anti-discrimination laws that you can that can help, right? That provides an opportunity to try and correct and try and again have a positive impact on the space where we have sort of legal and compliance footing to take action. So remember that anti-discrimination and anti-harassment laws are very compliance oriented. They really are designed, a lot of the law is designed to reward efforts to eradicate racism and sexism and ageism from the work environment, right? And I don't know what the ism is, but things about LGBTQ, right? Sort of exclusionary practices, words, and actions around LGBTQ plus status as well. And so I want us to give some thought to the idea that look, a lot of times companies look at the complaint process around discrimination concerns or harassment concerns in a very adversarial way, right? In a very defensive way. And I want us to just challenge that notion a bit in our minds, right? Because a lot of times as attorneys, our first instinct is be defensive and be adversarial. I used to work with someone who said, never apologize ever. And I used to think he was joking. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I think he's probably serious. I think he's probably serious, right? And it's a very common sort of approach or mentality, right? When us attorneys are guiding employers. But keep in mind that process itself, right? If someone's raising an issue and they say, Joe said this thing in the lunchroom yesterday that really bothered me. And it may seem like a small thing, right? And let's say that something that Joe said was something negative or derogatory or, about race, about gender, about sexual orientation, right? Um, and and a company might sort of try to go into protect mode right away. I'm going to protect the company. Why are they bringing up this small issue? It's not even a big deal. So what? Someone makes these comments, right? But let's try to just think about the other perspectives and some of these issues we've been talking about today, right? Um, Perhaps it's this person saying, I would love if someone here could recognize what I go through every day, right? And how painful that is in larger society, right? Not necessarily in this work environment. And that these comments, these small comments or these small actions are reminding me of all that. And that's the last thing I want when I'm here at work trying to focus on what I'm doing, right? Trying to focus on getting work done. And so when those challenges come up, it's actually an opportunity to have a dialogue, right? Have a dialogue. And that's right in line with those compliance requirements. And so really compliance with these laws create a great opportunity before anything turns into an adversarial sort of situation to resolve some of these conflicts in a really helpful. So I see Kevin's up,
Yeah,
which is my
I'm
signal.
here. Yeah, and I know you have a lot more, and I think we're gonna have to bring you back to do the second half of this. This is probably a good turning point.
Yep,
I did want
absolutely.
to ask you a question that came in from the
Sure.
audience because I think it's a really good one. So I think have very really explained why it's important that we create a place to have conversation. One of the comments came in, and I've seen this from other folks. It says, how do you handle employees who, and again, it's not who have a different perspective on something that's important to someone else? So, how do we allow that? And again, it's not, I think we're not saying to the standpoint of saying it's a racist comment, but if someone doesn't agree as to maybe what the impact is or what we should be doing about something. How do you manage that dialogue? Because that escalation of the dialogue is sometimes what's, so the easiest one was a political in the fall, because that became very volatile in society and all that came in. But what do you recommend to an HR manager or a leader of a company when to allow people to, what's the best way to allow there to be both voices heard, even if it's a very sensitive topic?
Yeah.
And again,
I
I'm
think
not saying someone saying I'm racist. I'm just saying I don't maybe agree with the remedy that someone feels very strongly about.
right. So if we're talking about a remedy in terms of actual, society, how we change things outside of the workplace, right? I say that's something we leave out of the workplace, right? That's we do want to try and set those boundaries, and we want to try and do it in a very empathetic way, right? That we recognize that this is really important to you and to many of us. I'm not saying necessarily, right, that it's
Right.
we agree with the solution, but these are not things that we really are here to solve in this workplace, right? We can't. That's not the purpose of this workplace. But what we can do is make sure that you have an environment where you feel comfortable bringing your best self to work every day. And so, if anything is ever coming up in this work environment that is making you uncomfortable, you come here to us and let's talk about it. Right. And when we are talking about these issues with each other, not having a big political debate, we want to draw those lines. But if something's coming up in this work environment that relates to these topics, we can have those discussions, but we've got to do it in a respectful way, right? And the EOC, their word in the past was in a civil way, with civility, with courtesy. We may not fully agree, we may not see eye to eye precisely, right? We may not end up on the exact same page, but we can talk about those pages in the book, right, in a respectful and a civil manner. And that's sort of our go-to in legal compliance, is let's come back to that civility, and really being able to dialogue in that way. But there certainly are also, conflict resolution, emotional intelligence is tremendously helpful in this space, right? So, um, as much as you can equip your leaders with conflict resolution skills, right, and emotional intelligence skills, that will go a very long way to helping in those day-to-day moments of resolving these issues, or at least talking about these issues, I should say, in a way that doesn't create more risk.
Great. Well, Sienna, as always, your insight on the DEI space, which is so multifaceted. That's why we keep having you come back every month or so, because there's another layer to peel back on kind of what we're all facing. And I know your empathy and expertise has been valued by members. So thank you for sharing today with us.
Yeah. Well,
We will now turn it over to Amy to share the expertise on the kind of COVID side.